Hello, everyone. My name is Rahima Obed, and I work at the Paul Ramsey Foundation as Impact Analyst. I welcome you all today on behalf of ARTD and the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership team. The webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be available to you along with the evaluation report by the end of the webinar or latest by tomorrow. So the agenda for today's webinar is we'll start off with introductions and acknowledgement. ARTD will present a snapshot of evaluation findings. We will then reflect upon what we've learned from conducting this evaluation, ARTD in particular from the perspective of them being the evaluator, as well as TQKP and PRF will also share their learnings from the evaluation from the perspective of being the funder as well as the grant partner. TQKP will then reflect upon how they're using their findings from this evaluation report. We will do some of the discussions around the key takeaways from this evaluation, and then we'll open the floor for question and answer session. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Gadigal land, the people of the Eora Nation from which I'm joining today, as well as the traditional custodians of the lands that my co-speakers are joining from. The lands of the Kulin Nation in Narm and the lands of the Jagera people and the Turrbal people in Mianjin. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. And I also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So begin with, we'll give you a quick introduction to PRF, TQKP, and ARTD. PRF, the Paul Ramsey Foundation, is one of TQKP's funding partners and is a philanthropic foundation that works for a future where people and places have what they need to thrive, and PRF invests in, builds, and influences the conditions needed to stop disadvantage in Australia. PRF commissioned ARTD to evaluate Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership in 2022, and this PRF's interest was majorly born out of Michael Hogan's fellowship at PRF, who explored how systems can be mobilized to enhance well-being of children and families. This was especially relevant as early childhood development system was fragmented and disjointed at the time the fellowship was conducted. And on top of this, the child development rates in Queensland were amongst the worst in Australia. Also, from our study at PRF of international literature, evidence pointed to the role of system intermediaries mobilizing and bringing different elements of the system together rather than reinventing the wheel or introducing new elements to the system. And so TQKP presented a geographically based opportunity for PRF to respond to this challenge in Queensland. I will now like to hand over to Kate, who will then introduce ARTD. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Rahima. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So my organisation, ARTD Consultants, is an evaluation consultancy, and we work with our clients to provide the evidence to inform their programs, decisions and strategies. My name is Kate Sunners, and it's been my pleasure and privilege to work with the teams from TQKP and PRF, as well as our partners from the Institute of Social Science Research at the University of Queensland on this evaluation of TQKP. And the work that TQKP does to influence systems through partnership-led approaches is deeply interesting to evaluate, and it's allowed our team opportunities to apply systems thinking and to do so in a quite dynamic context, which is infinitely engaging for us evaluators. To give you a little bit of a background to TQKP, I'm aware that many of you will be aware of the work of TQK, but some of you, it might be new or in a different state. So Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is an intermediary, as Rahima said, and a coalition of leaders, organisations, practitioners and academics from across Queensland who work with a shared purpose. And this purpose is to drive systems change and to address key systemic barriers, so political, structural, cultural, operational, to improve child wellbeing. It was established in 2020, auspiced by the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Young People, ARACI, and TQKP is currently focused on delivering 11 key initiatives and related projects, which you'll see up there on the screen, and they are led and facilitated by a small backbone team. And this work is funded by a group of philanthropies and also receives funding from some of its Queensland collaborators. TQK's work is oriented around the 6 systems levers and 8 threads that you can see there in the beautiful colours, and these are used as key frameworks to orient the planning and co-design of TQKP's initiatives and actions. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a background to understand what we're talking about through the findings of the evaluation. So just to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the evaluation, In this phase, we aim to answer 2 overarching key evaluation questions with some additional sub-questions, and these were around what methods are working best for engaging the multi-sector organisations as partners in TQKP, and also around how TQKP should work to improve the use of data and evidence in the system. Our approach drew on developmental evaluation approaches and a systems thinking perspective, with particular attention on group reflection on the what, so what, now what questions from developmental evaluation, and also attention to the goals of subsystems, shifts in systems leverage points, as well as any external and systems factors acting as barriers to change. We drew on a variety of different methods. Our partners at Institute of Social Science Research undertook interviews with 9 policy decision makers to understand their attention on the issue of child and youth wellbeing and levels of willingness to invest a concerted effort over long periods, as well as to identify any political factors that worked as barriers or enablers to TQKP's goals. And these were people who weren't necessarily involved directly in TQKP, but who were within the sectors and work within the issue areas that TQKP desires to influence. We used a bellwether methodology that asks open-ended questions about what policies are highest priority for those decision makers and progressively drill down to the area of children and youth wellbeing and then to familiarity with TQKP's work. We also undertook 11 backbone team interviews and a review of 289 documents, which we reviewed against a rubric developed around TQKP's systems levers and goals. And after analysing the data, we had a sense-making workshop with the backbone team and also a couple of representatives from one of their funders to help with the synthesis of the findings, provide some context around these and validate them with the group. To answer the question about the methods which work best for engaging multi-sector partners, we needed to first take a step back and assess the extent to which engagement was being achieved. And you can see here a little of the complexity of the system and the work that TQKP has embarked on and what it's really taken to get here. So we had a crack at categorising the organisations engaged with TQKP as part of our evaluation, and we found 23 different types of organisation, which you can see there on the bottom left. And the figure on the right shows many of the TQKP initiatives, not all of them, and the organisations who are involved at that deep level of engagement of co-development or co-production or partnership on each initiative. So that's definitely not everyone who's ever touched base with TQKP or engaged at every level, but I think it gives you a sense of how many organisations are involved, even just from this sort of partial mapping, and that many are also involved in multiple initiatives as well. And so what we found in the evaluation was that through their involvement in TQKP initiatives, people are working with people that they would not normally work with, and that they're more connected across sectors than before TQKP existed. We also found that there's been progressively deeper engagement in training initiatives and working groups, and that over the period of the evaluation, people have moved from just kind of being aware of TQKP's work to then leading actions and acting as ambassadors. And this is the model we came up with to reflect what we saw in the data about engagement with TQKP through its establishment and as it has matured over time. And so over time, what you can see there is that the relationships and ways of working together has deepened, people have become more engaged. You can also see that the greater number of people are engaged at the top level of being aware of TQK or its initiatives, and this is kind of something you would expect to see because it's pretty easy to create awareness. There are smaller groups engaged at that leadership or ambassador level, which makes sense given that that requires them to commit time and resources, which not everyone in the system has the capacity or the motivation to do. And we potentially might see the shape of this funnel change over time as more partners become involved in leading projects. So that was helpful for us to be able to provide that as a visual. What we found in terms of what was working well to catalyse the network is that TQKP tailors their approach to different interests and ways of working. And that's important because of the different motivations of different subsystems or parts of the system. Things which TQKP is really intentional about doing and which work to increase their reach and potential for catalytic action are having partners lead initiatives with a TQKP lead person embedded in other organisations. And what this has done is to create numerous relationships that didn't previously exist, harnessing the relationships of both TQKP and the lead organisations. And this has included relationships with funders, which would not have otherwise existed, with national bodies and with sectors who are otherwise unlikely to have been involved with lead organisations. The second thing is around being responsive and opportunistic to what's capturing the interest of the system or subsystems, which enables TQKP to capitalise on areas where energy and focus lies. So an example of that is the current focus on and interest in place-based initiatives at a state and federal level. And this also allows them to plug into existing networks and resources. They're also responsive to opportunities that come up that increase their reach. So, for example, when Children's Week came up, their framing initiative worked to co-design some resources around the language used around play, and these were co-designed by the group and then further developed by Thriving Queensland Kids Network and the Queensland Family and Child Commission for distribution. So that's an example of the opportunistic response. The third thing that they do is to take an approach of being open to all and have really created an open and safe space for large numbers of organisations and individuals to involve themselves to the degree that they are capable of and able to. But they also work strategically to ensure that the right people and the necessary people are involved at the right levels to drive systems change. An example of this is TQKP's continuous effort to engage the Queensland Department of Premier and Cabinet, and also to drive engagement with organisations and actors who might not have previously been involved in these types of conversations or collaborative efforts. In terms of the approaches that worked well to align the values of various organisations, we found that the systems levers are really helping people to understand systems thinking and apply it to their own context. Erase is the NEST framework is providing a shared language around wellbeing domains for children and is used by systems actors to help shape practice and outcomes frameworks. And the co-production processes are providing a really good container for those trusting relationships to be built to allow people to hear each other's views and come to a consensus. And these same elements are working to build knowledge, awareness, and a pathway to action. The other thing that is helping to do so is TQKP's learning and development activities, and particularly notably, some of these are shifting mindsets for some participants. And that's really important because mindsets are at the top of the hierarchy of effective systems levers to pull if you're looking at the Daniela Meadows systems levers. And the literature points to them also being some of the hardest things to influence in terms of systems levers. But we are seeing that happening through TQKP's training initiatives. TQKP is also working to improve how the system uses data and evidence. And to do this, we found that they're taking a two-pronged approach. So they're taking action to build better data and evidence systems, and they're also building capacity and capability around collecting and using evidence. And this latter is important and necessary because of the varied levels of knowledge and ability in the system to engage with collecting, analysing, presenting and sharing data and evidence. And so what that's doing is creating then the foundational knowledge needed for people to participate in the activities that are focused on building better data and evidence systems. Early on in the piece, TQKP was encountering a few different barriers around addressing improvement of the use of data and evidence at the level of the whole system, and so pivoted to an approach focused on pockets of the system, so those sort of subsystem levels. An example of this is family hubs, the early childhood sector, and the First Nations child and family wellbeing sector. And we found that these are more strategic places to intervene because they are at a scale within which it's more feasible to have influence within current resourcing that TQKP has. They're areas in which TQKP has strong existing relationships and traction through its portfolio of work. They also have shared characteristics and goals, which makes it simpler to identify overlaps and opportunities for improvement to and synchronisation of outcomes measurement. And they also provide a less complex environment in which to test some of those different data collection and outcome measurement approaches and to be able to assess their effectiveness. And so at this stage of the maturity of the system and TQKP's initiatives within it, working at that subsystems level is more likely to yield results and lead to examples of successes which can then be shared back with other partners and parts of the system to increase capability and confidence. Another of the sub-questions of the evaluation was what learnings could be obtained for collective measures that may inform the future work of TQKP, but also other future systems change work. And so our evaluation has noted several potential barriers, risks and issues with working to embed collective measures in a system as large and diverse as the one which TQKP works to influence. And these include the significant commitment of time and resources required, the fact that once shared measures are embedded, that they can then become extremely difficult to change as the context changes, and because of the risk of over-reliance on shared measures, potentially at the risk of more meaningful measures. But what is more feasible to influence in a system of this scale is the commitment of the organisations and people in the system to use data and evidence and to use shared outcomes dimensions like those provided by ARACI's The Nest framework. TQKP's work to familiarise people with the Nest framework and the system's levers we found to be TQKP's strongest approach to synchronising the measurement of outcomes by systems actors for two reasons. Firstly, they're conceptual frameworks rather than a series of indicators to be applied, and as such they can inform additions and improvements to existing data capture frameworks, which makes the scale of change more feasible and less likely to encounter barriers in resourcing and motivation than, say, a full-scale renovation of what organisations already have in place to measure. And secondly, because they're conceptual frameworks and they're high level enough, people can bring their own context and their own organisation's delivery objectives and marry the two together quite well. There are examples already of the Nest framework being used by systems actors in the shaping of their data collection and reporting, and one of the really great examples is QFCC, which has explicitly oriented its Data Explorer site around the Nest framework wellbeing domains. And there are also examples of place-based initiatives using those domains with some adaptations to inform their data gathering activities. But given that the capacity and capability of the system is quite variable around measuring outcomes and data, using data and evidence, collecting, etc., what we said in our evaluation was that if organisations are to, at a larger scale, implement changes to their measurement of outcomes based on the Nest framework and systems levers, that they will likely need some support to do that. As Rahima said, the report will be shared with you after the webinar, so if you're interested in going deeper into some of those findings, you can have a little read of that once that email comes out. So we also wanted to share our reflections on what each of us learned through being involved in this evaluation, because we've got the learnings from the evaluation, but we've also got the meta learnings on top of that. And one of the things that we wanted to pick up on from this evaluation is around the most useful role for evaluators in the formational phase of a systems change initiative like TQKP. And I think this will be useful for those of you who commission evaluations as well as for those working on similar systems change initiatives or similar complex initiatives that are just at that formational stage. So when we were commissioned to undertake the evaluation, TQKP was still developing. We were tasked with developing a plan to evaluate TQKP when what TQKP looked like was something a little bit like this. So there was a solid core, there was all the evidence and the plans, but the relationships were still forming and team members were still being onboarded. And because everything for TQKP is done collaboratively, some of the details of initiatives were in the early stages of being co-designed, or they weren't yet at that stage. Processes and technology for the backbone team was still being set up, and no one yet knew what kinds of data they would be routinely gathering from the backbone team that we could use in the evaluation. The TQKP monitoring and evaluation framework for their own internal evaluation was still being developed as well, and so timeframes for the data collection activities had not yet been planned. So if we were to do it again in this stage of development, we feel like we could have been of more value to TQKP as a critical friend and focusing more of our efforts at this early stage on helping TQKP clarify its intent, thinking together about the system and the boundaries, considering the different levels of the system being targeted for change by various initiatives, and the links between proposed activities and outcomes, and also helping to frame some questions to help explore emergent directions and feedback loops. And in contrast, we were focused on delivering an evaluation plan. And so this had ramifications for how we were able to implement the evaluation as TQKP's plans evolved through their implementation and learning, which is a necessary part of their approach and work. And so in retrospect, and with potentially different parameters, a better plan would have been for us to focus more on learning together in that formative period and to formulate an evaluation approach a little later down the track. And we could also, looking back, have built in more cycles of reflection with the whole Backbone team, including to sort of reflect on whether or not the evaluation approach was working, including in parallel with their own internal evaluation as well. So we would say if you're commissioning or working on an evaluation of a similar systems change or developmental initiative in a formative stage, certainly bring in an evaluation team early. They can be really useful, but ensure that those early deliverables are focused on supporting the project team to make explicit those links between their plan and the expected outcomes. Doing things like stress testing assumptions about how the program will work, identifying any potential barriers, and supporting development of strategies. Another learning from conducting this evaluation was that defining the system which TQKP works to influence was really critical to allowing us to be able to answer the key evaluation questions. And one of the features of TQKP, which I'm sure those of you who know the organisation know very well, is that it's different from other collective impact initiatives in that it's not exclusive to a particular issue area. So for example, homelessness, such as something like Advance to Zero Brisbane and Logan. And it's also not exclusive to a bounded community. So for example, a place-based initiative like Logan Together. And this just makes it a little bit more conceptually difficult to define where are the edges of that system, where are the boundaries of that system. And the way that TQKP defined the system for their purposes was everything in Erase's The Nest framework, basically all the systems at all levels that interact with a child and family that shape their lives. However, if you've ever worked with an evaluator, you'll know that we deal in definitions, and when it comes to systems, we look at boundaries. So this definition was a little bit too broad for us to use to be able to answer the key evaluation questions for our purposes. Because if the system is sort of just about, includes just about everyone, how do you kind of measure the success of engagement strategies, and how do we think about system boundaries in a large scale and dynamic system? So through iterative discussions with TQKP and internally with our team as well, and through analysing the data, we came to a definition of the system that bridges both the nest and our need to define the system boundaries. And this is that TQKP works to influence all the service systems working in any of those domains in the nest, but also that the boundaries of the system, which TQKP works to influence, are to a large extent defined by those sectors and actors who are willing to work with them. And what this means is that the boundaries of the system are likely to be continuously growing and shifting as actors move in and out of engagement with TQKP or in and out of roles which permit them to collaborate with TQKP. Defining the system by the sectors and actors willing to work with TQKP rather than trying to necessarily pin down a list of sectors who are inside the system boundary really allowed us to better understand engagement with TQKP and what this means in relation to its goals for the system. It also informed our recommendation that at the level of the relational conditions for systems change, which Andrew will talk a little bit about, TQKP should aim to maximise the number of new people entering their networks who report that they're engaging more and better with other people aligned with their common interests. And this refined understanding of the system will also help us to inform our data collection and analysis in the next phase of the evaluation. I'll pass over to our Chief Evaluator, Andrew, who will give you a little bit more systems thinking background.
All right, Kate. Well, only a little bit more because I think you've covered a lot of practical insights that would come out of that. But yes, as everyone would have heard when we started this webinar today, the system comes up a lot. And it can be challenging in systems evaluation to understand, well, hang on, what is the system? It could be so big and vague, as Kate has already talked about. So two things that we think about often as evaluators of systems change is, I think Michael Hogan once described systems change itself as counter-structural and counter-cultural. and to which we might add that evaluation can somewhat be counterintuitive. Most people, when they think of evaluation, think about you do something, you measure the outcomes, and you determine the value of what you did based on how much it changed some outcomes, which works really well in a simple system, works well in a laboratory, but runs into problems the more complex the system becomes, at the more levels of the system you're trying to transverse. So that, in short, what we think is useful in systems evaluation is trying to break down the questions for evaluations into meaningful, bite-sized chunks that are understandable. And so whenever we do evaluation, we are always super keen to understand the theory of change, or the rationale that underpins anyone's interventions. And TKQP, luckily, we're explicit about theirs, and we had one here in the waters of systems change, so we could get an inside look at how systems thinking was being thought of here. But of course, there's many, many different ways to thinking of systems change, just as there are many, many ways of evaluating systems change, because there's many, many types of systems, right? So a simple form of system you might think of is a car. It has many parts, independent parts, but once they come together, you get a new property, and that's driving. And driving wasn't actually a property of any one of those parts, but it was a new property that emerged by putting these parts together. And that's one of the defining features of a system, is often you get something new as a result of putting together independent parts. Daniela Meadows, who's popularized the levers of systems change, would define systems as a set of parts that come together for some purpose. And that's one approach to systems evaluation. Systems change tries to identify the purpose of the system and then work back from that. And that's fine when it's a car, purpose is driving. It's fine when it's a place-based intervention and you have a group of people who more or less agree on the purpose of why they're coming together. But then you get different types of systems that makes it difficult. You get systems that generate problems. In our case, we have an economic system that doesn't really sufficiently value child rearing and education of children, such that the value placed on that labour is much lower. That's a capitalist system that gives rise to a problem. That's a different kind of system and needs to be looked at differently. And then you've got systems that are contested where there's no clear agreement on the purpose of the system. Child protection systems and debates about permanency of placement and things like that. So you can see you can go from a relatively simple uncontested system to one where it's very murky and many things going on. And the more often in public policy, we're dealing with those very, very contested, complex systems. So this approach of the waters of systems change sort of breaks systems down into different levels. So the way we thought about, as evaluators, as Kate said, we wanted to approach the evaluation with the same theory that the people developing the intervention had. And so once we came across this, it was really helpful, because we can go, okay, you can look at this in three different levels. You can, first of all, you have to say, what is the system? And Kate's already talked about that in terms of boundaries and how we do that in a practical sense. But there's also the question of what level of the system are we trying to change? But here we've got three different levels. Transformative change, which is the deepest level, which is about people's mental models, their deeply held beliefs and values and what they think about. Are we trying to change those? And then the question is whose? The NEST framework might be really good for changing language and terms for people who are engaged. But is it changing the minds of politicians and other people? Is it transforming how everybody in the street thinks about this issue? That's a question. And in every case, in every strategy of change, you have to make decisions about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, because it's hard to do everything, or it's impossible to do everything, right? So that's why we think about pick a level that you're going at, or one or more, and be explicit about that, and then think about the boundary of the system. We use the phrase sometimes, to paraphrase Stephen Covey, focus on your sphere of influence first, that is the people that are willing to talk to you, and watch that grow and expand to become more like your sphere of interest, which in this case would be the entire Queensland and population and everybody in it, and the way that they deal with children. But that may be too ambitious. If you want to measure how much you change that as your first goal, you might be making life pretty difficult for yourself. So this approach has these three different levels. And so if you're choosing a level at the deepest level we talked about, we think that the semi-explicit conditions of relational change is a really great place for systems change initiatives to think about. things, because it's about, as Kate said, it's about what somebody said in one of the workshops that we did. Are people doing, are they working together more than they otherwise would with people as a result of this initiative? Was a pretty good measure of how this is working at a relational level. Methods like social network analysis and others, there's ways of collecting data to quantify and measure those relationships and how they're changing from an evaluator's perspective. At the transformative change level, the methods, I should say, for example, as Kate mentioned, was like these bellwether interviews, kind of like blind interviews where the interviewee doesn't know what you're asking them about, but you're trying to see, are they using the language, the terms, and things that are part of the initiative. So it's starting to get to that. And then you've got at the most shallow level, these explicit domains of systems change. And these are often things where the question is about the appropriateness, efficiency, and effectiveness of something that was funded, an action that was actually determined as something that we should do. And once you've determined what the system is, the boundaries and your sphere of influence, and you've thought about the level of change that you're going at, and you might have more than one, you might have different initiatives targeted at different levels. We find that then there's essentially like 3 questions that are useful to ask. In systems change, you don't ever usually expect to find an answer to what works. There's things that are working better or worse for different people in different situations, and the world is constantly changing. So we don't see evaluation as an endpoint where you accumulate knowledge about what works. In these situations, you're constantly inquiring and probing and testing the system and seeing if you can make it, nudge it in better directions. And sort of 3 questions that can be useful is asking about, if you're putting it in the terms of a funder for a second, you can ask these questions from the perspective of the provider of the funded services, or you can do it from the funder. So if you're thinking about it from a funder's perspective, once you've got some agreement on what's the system we're trying to change and what levels are we trying to change in what ways, you can think about, are we funding the right things? Did the fundee do what they said they would do? And do the current system parameters suggest we should do more of the same or something different? And you can see those questions can be recast without the funder in the room to think about things like, are we doing the right things? Are we doing things right? What makes these the right things to do? And as you can see, these are questions that are constantly being raised and then partially answered. Actions are being taken. They're being able to be documented and be clear about, pretty simple questions. But once so that's pretty much all I'm going to say. There's some other links here. You can follow it further if you want. But I guess the key insight here is think about the boundaries and the levels. And if you can break your problem into bite-sized chunks, you can have, I think, more coherent and clear discussions with partners and others about why we're doing this over here and doing that over here, why it all hangs together. Because there's a real problem with systems and systems evaluation that people say it's on complex, and then they mean it's difficult, and then human beings are not having focused conversations with each other, and then that makes collective action more difficult because we're thinking we're talking about different things. So as Kate said, in this case, the nest is a really good example of a way of keeping language consistent. That's an important element. But I think that's really all we need to say. One of the points I just wanted to add, my favorite part of the workshop, what we did the other day, Kate, was I think someone from TKQP was talking about a particular person who one of the stakeholders involved in one of their activities, and her role was simply just to constantly ask why are we doing it this way? What makes this a good idea? And I think the story as it was told to me was that this started off coming a little annoying as people keep questioning everything, but then realized that she said, that's how I get change. That's how I got change in my frontline service delivery role, by constantly querying and questioning why are we doing things, what makes this the right thing to do. And as Kate said at the beginning, that's really the best role I think an evaluator can play, particularly in something as complex as systems changes, as a critical friend, and sitting there and helping you and the funder really answer this question, why are we doing this, what makes this the right thing to do, and keep asking why. So I enjoyed that. So I think that's enough from me. You can follow some links if you want to read more, and thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to hand over to Camilla to give you a few insights from TKKP's perspective.
Thanks, Kate. Like Kate said, my name is Camilla Davidson, and my role within Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is in evaluation and innovation and research. And I'm really excited to share with you some reflections on Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership's journey in participating in this external evaluation. This process has been insightful, it has been challenging at times, but it has been rewarding for our team and our key partners and collaborators who have all contributed significant amount of time and energy throughout this process. And so I just wanted to acknowledge everyone's contribution here. At Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, we understand that evaluation is more than just measuring and reporting our progress, our successes, our challenges. For us, it's an opportunity to reflect, to learn, adapt, and grow. And the process of participating in this evaluation has certainly further emphasized to us the importance and need for engaging in regular individual and group reflections. For us, participating in this evaluation reinforced even further than adopting that collaborative approach is truly invaluable in all aspects of our work. Time and time again, we learn that there is a great value in investing time in establishing and then nurturing meaningful and mutually beneficial relationships that allow us to have open, real, and deep conversations in a safe space. And so we feel that there is a great benefit in spending a bit of time to build those solid foundations for a collaboration that brings in diverse perspectives and ideas, a collaboration that challenges us, that extends our thinking, and ultimately enhances our work. This has always been a fundamental part in our approach and our work, and has certainly been further reinforced through our work with ARTD. Another takeaway from us is that value of co-design and adaptation. Working together in a true and real way is really important and something that we do in our work. It's critical to feel like an authentic contributor and participant in the process of co-design, and to work together in evaluation, particularly here on methodology and adopting it accordingly, from deciding on timing, audience methods, and so on. And so we see real value in being a part of discussions around how the evaluation should take shape to ensure that its outcomes are meaningful to everyone who's involved. We dedicated into continuous reflecting, learning, and improving what we do and how we do our work. And that means taking that regular time to look at what we do, look at our work, and understand what's working, what's not working, and why, and willing and wanting to make changes based on what we learn. We strive to stay open to new ideas, to innovation, to new information. And so we really appreciate the findings and recommendations from this report, because they helped us to adapt our approach straight away, and also helped us shape phase 3 proposal and strategy, which Michael will cover in a little while. And so to sort of sum up what we've learned, or what has been further reinforced to us, is that working together, truly working together, leads to deeper reflections, to greater understanding of our work and its outcomes, and ultimately into more impactful change. Thank you, and I'll just pass on to Rahima, I believe, from PRF.
Thank you, Camilla. Now, from PRF's perspective, learnings from TQKP evaluation are especially important, as PRF, under its new strategy, is proactively thinking about system change and how multiple levers need to be pulled to shift conditions. So firstly, the evaluation learnings have prompted PRF, and especially the measurement, evaluation, research, and learning team within the PRF, of which I'm a part of, to think about developing our own stakeholder map and see how PRF can benefit from existing relationships and boost networking opportunities for initiatives like TQKP and others. Secondly, we've learned that supporting early mapping and engagement of key stakeholders is really important for complex systems-focused initiatives like Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. And related to this point is setting of realistic expectations around timelines to enable engagement of key stakeholders, so that any likely delays in the formalization of partnerships are accounted for. Thank you. I will now hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Rahima. And I will hand over to Michael Hogan, who's TQKP's Executive Convener, who will share a little bit about how TQKP is using the evaluation findings. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks to Rahima and Andrew and Camilla. Can I acknowledge I'm joining you from the lands of the Turrbal Yagara people in Yanjin, where we have the privilege of living and working. Can I just acknowledge, before I take you to how we're using the findings, to, I guess, reinforce some of the themes you might have heard from Kate and Andrew and Camilla about TQKP as a collective vehicle for doing and learning. And so we really value the partnership and collaboration with ARTD, and of course, the investment and the collaboration and partnership with PRF and our other co-investors, co-investing philanthropies, and the government agencies and authorities who are leaning in both with cash, but most importantly with their hearts and minds. So we had huge value from the in-kind contributions of collaborators from across the not-for-profit sector, the government sector, and the tertiary sector. But we're always asking those questions, as you heard from Camilla, about, you know, are we doing the right things? Are we doing them the right way, as Andrew said? And how do we know whether we're doing them right? I guess Andrew in particular has touched on some of the sort of core design features and conundrums of the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. The impetus for TQKP came out of the lived experience of families and of practitioners and of systems leaders, of whom I've been one, about the deep frustration of making our systems work well for families and their children. And that's not, of course, unique to Queensland. So our value proposition was really deliberately to target the rubs and gaps between sectors, between systems, between disciplines, and between services at all levels. So it is, as we call it, humbly audacious. But we don't want to compete or duplicate with the other intermediaries and reform initiatives and extraordinary institutes and not-for-profits and authorities that we've got in our ecosystem. But there was no one else in the space trying to deal with those rubs and gaps. And so we've grappled a lot with the scope and scale, depth, breadth questions that Kate and Andrew have touched on. But I guess one of the things that we've taken out of the evaluation and the learnings to date and the feedback we've had from the folks who are ARTD interviewed and who we've engaged with through our partnership surveys is the value that people who are finding us, leaning into us, collaborating through us are garnering from this involvement in this collective vehicle. And so our phase 3 strategy, which we're developing, we've just released a few weeks ago a draft strategy for phase 3 that will run, we hope, for 5 years from 2025 to 2030. It's been developed collaboratively under the stewardship of our leadership table and our partners. It doesn't step back from a big ambition about what we want for our kids in Queensland. And so we continue to take that holistic, ecological, multi-systemic view about the contribution we can make as one of the actors in our ecosystem that can contribute to changing the odds for kids to thrive. But we've also taken some of the learnings and reflections that we've had through the evaluation process to help us sort of really try and clarify the focus areas for the next phase and the methodologies that we use to generate momentum and indeed to generate a movement of leaders and collaborators all committed to Queensland Kids Thriving. So as you saw from those earlier slides, we started phase 2 with a theory of change built around 6 systems levers what emerged then were these 8 threads that you saw on one of the slides. So what are those threads that we could use to weave stronger connections and capabilities through our systems? And then that was manifested, though, that sort of theory of change was manifested in 10 initially, and then at the last moment, 11 collaborative initiatives. So the leadership table has continuously challenged us about the sort of breadth and scope and scale of what we're doing. So what's emerged is that we've actually, we're putting back to our ecosystem a proposition that we bring that back to 6 portfolios and to more, to go back to our sort of fundamental purpose and theory of change around those systems levers. To bring an intergenerational approach to that next strategy, to position our leadership table and leaders at all levels in our ecosystems and help build the stewardship that our ecosystem needs. And to continue to try and distribute the leadership and responsibility for collective facilitation by working with partners and collaborators. So we will really try in phase 3 to take sort of key learnings from phase 2 about our brokerage and curation role, and our partnering then with organisations and entities that leaders that really take up the baton and lead the collaboratives that are the vehicle for the practical collaborative systems work. What another I guess experience that's emerged in phase 2 is that we've had the privilege and opportunity to also connect with and work with other systems initiatives. For example, the Thrive by 5 Alliance. So we've worked with Minderoo, we've worked with a fantastic group of collaborators in Queensland who formed the Thrive by 5 Queensland Alliance. So that focus on ECEC, that focus on early child development. It picked up from the work we'd done with our early child development working group. But fortuitously, we had the opportunity then to leverage and piggyback onto another piece of infrastructure, generously supported by the Minderoo Foundation through the Thrive by 5 Alliance. So that opportunity to affiliate, to align, to connect with other systems intermediaries, whether they're happening at a national, state and local level, gives us a sort of a third stream to the overall partnership. And so we're looking to bring that through and make that more explicit in phase 3. So we we're testing these sort of propositions now. I would encourage anyone who's interested in what we're looking to do in phase 3 to jump into our brand new website, www.tqqp.org.au, because the draft phase 3 strategies are up there for consultation, and we're really encouraging folks to give us full and frank feedback and to indicate where they might be interested to lean into phase 3. We are in the midst of our conversations with philanthropic and other investors about phase 3, and it's been incredibly valuable for us to have the independent evaluation that PRF have commissioned with our IRTD as one of the really key resources we've been able to take into those conversations with philanthropies, to be able to demonstrate that we're committed to asking those questions that Andrew posed earlier, and that we're able to show how we're going to take the recommendations and findings and actually operationalise those in the way we go forward in phase 3. So we're really deeply appreciative of the contribution that IRTD have made to this collective learning and doing vehicle. We look forward to what else you'll share with us through the rest of the evaluation of phase 2. And we're incredibly excited about building on that and getting even smarter and more sophisticated about how we answer those questions as we go into phase 3. I'll hand it back or open it up.
Thank you so much, Michael. Speaking of the next phase of the evaluation, I'll give you a very quick overview of the next 2 key evaluation questions we're looking at. So next report is due in October 2025, and we'll have another of these events to share our learnings. The questions are around the evidence that's emerging that organisations and parts of the system will be enabled to make sustainable changes for youth, children and families, and whether the agreed upon measures of outputs and outcomes for TQKP best capture that progress, and some sub-questions there around the innovation and development program of work, which I think the language around that has shifted slightly, but how that's working to facilitate change within parts of the system, and also looking at the barriers and facilitators for TQKP's program of work to achieving large scale systems change. So yes, we will open it up for questions if we do have any in the chat. I think Rahima's going to coordinate those with us.
Yes, Kate, we have one question, and it's posed by Angela, and the question is around the involvement of smaller organizations, multicultural community members that aren't connected to TQKP. How do they bring in their voice and contribute to the important work of systems change that TQKP is engaged in?
It might be one for me, Rahima, is it?
Yes, Michael, or anyone from TQKP want to answer.
Camilla, please jump in too if you've got any thoughts. So that's a fantastic question, and from the very get-go, we have kept delving into the sort of opportunity and challenge and the sort of imperative of us being able to hear and amplify the voices, the lived experience of children, of infants and children and young people and their caregivers, and of practitioners and leaders, but in particular the lived experience of families, and what we can do to encourage systems to hear them. So Angela, I guess our primary approach has been to firstly to look to build in lived experience into co-design. Secondly, to I guess look for and encourage collaboration with partners that have a deep commitment to co-design and to community leadership, to lived experience. So, for example, the really close collaboration we've had through the Thriving Kids Network, and the extraordinary work that has happened in Logan Together over a decade through Logan Together and its partners. We love hearing and seeing how those voices get expressed in those initiatives and how we can then, pick them up and amplify those. You will see if you jump onto the new website, one of the things we've heard a lot, interestingly, about engagement is the challenge of consultation and engagement fatigue, and the barriers to real co-production. And so a simple thing we think we can do is to provide a portal or a vehicle for those reports that get generated about the lived experience of children and young people, and we hope soon caregivers and parents, to actually provide a clearinghouse and a learning lab to say, if you're interested in hearing and knowing what take children and young people have already said about what a good life means to them or what their experience of systems might be, here's a set of resources and reports that are just even available to our ecosystem over the last couple of years from Queensland or beyond. So we think we can provide a bit of a clearinghouse to really try and amplify and accelerate people, actually paying attention to what kids have already said or caregivers have already said to our ecosystems about how they experience us. But it's a great question, and one we hope to keep on, maturing as we go into phase 3.
Thank you, Michael. We have another question. Yes, Jane, the question around the webinar recording. A webinar recording will be shared as well as the evaluation report, and we can also send in the slides from today's webinar. Angela has a comment that my lived experience as a community member in Logan is more work has to be done on the ground to build community capacity to share their voice. Yeah. Thank you, Angela.
Angela, I totally agree with that. And we hope as our place work grows and extends and deepens in Queensland, even in Logan Together, with its commitments to First Nations first and lived experience and community led, that actually there's always room for improvement, and we can certainly need to take that to what your learnings to other places and other communities and other systems. So thanks for that.
If anyone has any further questions, you can pop them in the chat now. I might just quickly run through some key takeaways just to summarize, but we can always come back to any questions that you might need to have a little think about right in. These are kind of just a summary of what we've talked about today. So really important in this kind of work to identify what's in your sphere of influence to change and your strategies to change it. And that really makes it a lot easier to understand what's working. Finding a way to describe the boundaries and the levels of your system that you're working in and that you're operating at makes your evaluation findings much more likely to be representative of reality. So a good important first step. Ensuring that if you're a commissioner of evaluations or if you're working on an evaluation, that your focus early on in terms of your deliverables on systems change projects and initiatives in those kind of formative stages, especially when relationships are still building, are focusing on those things that are designed to help clarify thinking, interrogate logic and assumptions, rather than sort of moving straight towards planning the evaluation. And also that really important key takeaway that I think TQKP is amazing at building, is taking the time to build those relationships. Also equally important in any sort of evaluation relationship, building those relationships between the evaluator and evaluand early on, and particularly where there's a complex and developmental approach to the work, including lots of those opportunities to do that early work of learning together. So that was our key takeaways. If there are any other questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. It's also, you can also send questions through to me on that email that I've got there up on the screen, and I will funnel those through to the right person. It's really been a pleasure to share the findings and the lessons with you today, and hopefully you can take something as well from reading the evaluation report, even just the executive summary, which is a nice high-level summary of the findings. Yeah, hope today has been useful for you, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through. As mentioned, PRF will send through a recording of the webinar and the link to the evaluation report, and we'll also send the slides through as well. So yeah, happy reading, and thank you so much for coming along today. Were there any other questions in the chat, Rahima?
No other questions. But then if you have any questions, as Kate mentioned, you can send over to her, and we'll also be circulating email from PRF, and you can also direct questions to us. Thank you, everyone. We're now at the end of the webinar. Thank you to TQKP and ARTD team for their insightful learning and sharing of the learnings through this webinar. Thank you.